With 2022's The Game Awards happening today, I wanted to offer my take on why Elden Ring deserved to be recognized as Game of the Year, or at least to take the W in the Best Game Direction category. According to the criteria provided by the Game Awards, the winner of the award for Best Game Direction must have, quote, outstanding creative vision and innovation in game direction and design, end quote. Now, for my money, Elden Ring's take on the open world genre uses one of the genre's most criticized design aspects, the repetitious use of assets, and transforms this technical limitation into incredible, novel bits of gameplay and player experiences, which just so happen to also interface with and advance the themes of the game, but that's going to have to wait for another video. That Elden Ring should be considered for numerous categories in 2022's The Game Awards is almost undisputable. Metacritic shows that the combined critic score is 96 out of 100, a number compiled from 84 reviews, all of which are categorized as being positive. Further, Metacritic's user score for Elden Ring, as of November 25th, 2022, averages 10,512 user scores, yielding a total score of 7.8 out of 10. From a broad perspective, then, Elden Ring is recognized as a pretty great game amongst a wide variety of audiences, both journalistic and otherwise. Of course, Elden Ring has received its fair share of criticism. One opinion that occupies space in the discourse surrounding the game is that the game's open world negatively affects the Soulsborne formula for which FromSoft are so famous. From Software, whose prior successes are Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro, among others, have achieved renown for their tight level design. Though their games are not exactly linear, the levels are designed to be navigated along one or more discrete paths. This often facilitates a handcrafted feel for FromSoft's levels, which results in their games feeling that they are designed to test and challenge you in unique and specific ways. Consider the journey through the Undead Burg in Dark Souls 1. This early level has a main path which leads to a boss, and some side paths that lead to extra items and NPCs. The enemies are placed and the architecture is designed such that each new section of the level presents the player with an intentionally designed encounter. Moreover, this path is not optional. You must learn how to navigate it successfully in order to progress to the next part of the game. Contrast this with standard open-world games where players can navigate levels in almost any way imaginable. Games of this type frequently forgo designer experiences in favor of dynamic experiences. Elden Ring bridges the gap between these two approaches by facilitating more dynamic experiences as players navigate between dungeons. Dungeons which in turn provide the designer experiences for which FromSoft are revered. This marriage of design approaches results in a massive game that attempts to provide the best that both worlds have to offer. Some have argued, however, that in trying to have the best of both worlds, Elden Ring detracts from the handcrafted, unique experiences which have yielded FromSoft such success in the past. The basic argument here is that Elden Ring's open world and the design decisions and limitations that it necessitates dilute rather than supplement the designer sections of the game. For many, the case in point for this argument is the, quote, extensive reuse of assets in the game, particularly the repetition both of enemies and of level design. In his critique of Elden Ring, Lextorius suggests that this is one of Elden Ring's central flaws.
So Elden Ring is big, but that's also the problem, because this game has an incredible amount of things in it, and not all of them are unique. Bosses, dungeons, and assets are reused all over the place, which is a problem that I think needs to be addressed.
After admitting that the scale of the game is impressive, Lextorius contends that its achievement is marred by its over-reliance on asset reuse. To illustrate this point, he discusses Elden Ring's bosses.
There are over 150 bosses in this game. To put that into perspective, Dark Souls 3 has 19 bosses according to its wiki page. The amount of actually unique bosses in this game seems to be around 70.
In other words, although Elden Ring technically has almost 9 boss fights for every 1 boss fight in the original Dark Souls, the amount of unique boss fights in Elden Ring compared to Dark Souls is closer to 4 to 1. The point here seems to be that Elden Ring sacrifices original design in order to produce massive scale. Even if you want to argue that there are some classic levels in the game that rank among the best that FromSoft has to offer, I think we can definitely admit that the overall effect of Elden Ring's large open world is a less focused, more dynamic game experience that does heavily rely upon recycled content. Yet, I still think the game deserves to win the award for Best Game Direction. To demonstrate why, let's think carefully about what else this design decision does beyond simply adding dynamic, less structured levels to what would otherwise be a tight and focused pseudo-successor to the Dark Souls series. To this end, let's look at how FromSoft uses the repetition of assets necessitated by their design decisions in order to produce incredibly interesting and compelling gameplay experiences. A close look at Elden Ring's Catacombs will demonstrate exactly how the game's implementation of open-world design uses its inherent shortcomings to produce novel gameplay experiences. The Catacombs exhibit some of the more apparent asset reuse in Elden Ring. They are a series of dungeons littered across Elden Ring's map that all have a similar look, a seemingly limited pool of enemy types, and a discrete and repetitious gameplay flow. Or, at least this is true for almost all of them. To make this case, let's examine the first catacombs that you are likely to encounter in the game, the Stormfoot Catacombs. This dungeon provides the basic gameplay flow for nearly all the other catacombs in the game. When first entering the dungeon, you see a locked door, and a path around the door. Proceeding down the path, you navigate through halls with fire-breathing statues, and fight some enemy mobs, which are very often stone imps, until you reach a lever that, when pulled, says that, somewhere, a heavy door has opened. Retracing your steps, you find the locked door at the beginning now open, and after walking through a wall of mist, you fight a boss. You beat the boss, collect the loot, and teleport back to the beginning of the dungeon. Pretty straightforward. Of course, not every catacomb dungeon follows this structure exactly. FromSoft designed each catacomb as iterative variations of the Stormfoot Catacombs, shuffling the elements to keep each dungeon fresh. Consider, for example, another catacomb dungeon from the early game, the Murkwater Catacombs. After entering this dungeon, you first fight some enemies. Then, directly in front of you is a lever that when pulled gives you the same message as you got in the Stormfoot Catacombs. But, instead of backtracking to the beginning of the dungeon, you must follow the side path and fight some more enemies while avoiding environmental hazards in order to reach the door behind which the boss fight is to occur. Note how the Murkwater Catacombs alter the flow of the Stormfoot Catacombs. In Stormfoot, you encounter locked door, environmental hazard, enemies, lever, unlocked door, boss, loot, exit. In Murkwater, you encounter enemies, lever, environmental hazard, enemies, unlocked door, boss, loot, exit. Using the same design elements, FromSoft alters the composition of the individual dungeon in order to produce a slightly different player experience. In other words, they use the repetition of assets in order to set, and then subsequently subvert the player's expectations for how these dungeons should work. But these minor variations amongst the catacombs are not the reason why I think Elden Ring should win the award for Best Game Direction. Rather, it is the particular way that one particular catacombs dungeon challenges and subverts the expectations built in other catacombs that I think makes Elden Ring worthy of the Best Game Design Award. So let's look at that dungeon. The Catacombs dungeon in question is the Leyndell Catacombs. This is a mid to late game dungeon that can be a bit difficult to find. What is remarkable about this dungeon is the way that it reuses assets iteratively to produce a novel player experience. Not only does this dungeon reuse the general Catacombs dungeon assets, but it repeats its own structure multiple times without becoming boring. So let's begin our look at this dungeon. The first thing that we encounter is familiar, a locked door and a path around it. Taking the path around the locked door, we're going to encounter a chamber with a tomb and some slugs in the water, and we're going to make our way around that. Continuing down the path, we're going to encounter a fork in the road. At this fork, we're going to see a room full of enemies and an item. We will kill the enemies, and then we will collect the item, and then we will go down the other fork in the path as this is a dead end. Returning to the fork to proceed in the dungeon, we encounter a room with some more enemies that we will take out, and then we will proceed to deal with the environmental hazards down the way. After the environmental hazard is dealt with, we will continue down the path, and this will lead us to another fork in the road, our second fork in this dungeon. If we continue straight, we will find ourselves in another chamber in which there's an enemy. We'll take out the enemy, and once the enemy is dealt with, we will activate the environmental hazard again to proceed to a second part of the chamber. This second part of the chamber will have another enemy in it that we will kill, And once the enemy is dead, we will collect the loot that is in the room and be forced to return to the fork in the path. That is the second fork in the path. And once again, you will take the other fork in order to progress further into the dungeon. This will lead you to a new chamber in which you will kill another enemy and collect another item and progress into another subchamber. And it is in this subchamber that things begin to get really interesting, because you look down in this subchamber into what appears to be the very first chamber that you entered into. If this is indeed the first chamber from the dungeon, when you run back through the hall, you will find a locked door and the Site of Grace, but instead, you find an unlocked door. This means one of two things. Either the game has broken the pattern established in earlier Catacombs dungeons, or you're not where you think you are. If you go to check on the boss room before you go to the Site of Grace, you'll see that there's no wall of mist, but there are some enemies to fight. Once you've killed these enemies, you can collect the loot that's in the room, but it's not the same kind of loot that you'd usually get in a boss room in a Catacombs dungeon. And, moreover, there's no way to teleport back to the front of the dungeon like there would be in a standard Catacomb dungeon boss room. So, you're definitely not in the boss room for the dungeon. At least, you're probably not. The only way to know 100% that you're not back where you began in this Catacombs dungeon is to go and make sure the Site of Grace is not across from the door. And, lo and behold, it's not there. So now, you can be 100% confident you are not in the beginning of the dungeon. So where in the world are you? Well, now the only choice you have is to go back to what you can now recognize as a copy of the first chamber of the dungeon. We're going to call it Chamber 1A. From here, you're going to continue down the path that mirrors the path that you first went on in the first part of the dungeon, and you're going to encounter another fork in the road that is almost identical to the previous, but not quite. We'll call it Fork 1A. This fork is clearly different than the previous one because there's no item to collect and there's no living enemies to kill. As we continue progressing in this dungeon, which is clearly almost copied and pasted from the first section of the dungeon, we get to Chamber 2A, which again is almost exactly the same as Chamber 2, but not quite, which is also true of Fork 2A, and is also true of Chamber 3A. If for the moment we skip going into the subchamber of Chamber 3A and go instead to Chamber 4A, then we'll discover something really interesting, something more overt that will cause us even more confusion about where exactly we're at. After we kill the first few enemies in the first part of this chamber, we climb the stairs, turn the corner, and discover an enemy standing over the body of what looks like the enemy that we killed previously in this dungeon. This causes us to question whether or not we're still in Chamber 4 or Chamber 4A, even though it's been pretty clearly demonstrated that we are not where we were in the beginning of the dungeon. The particular reuse of assets in this section of the dungeon causes the player massive confusion. Indeed, this dungeon uses recycled assets to make the player question their ability to parse reality. To really drive this point home, after killing that enemy, the only way to progress in the dungeon is to drop into another chamber that looks exactly like the first one in the dungeon. Of course, as you might expect, this is clearly not the first chamber, as you can't go back to where a door or a Site of Grace would be. Instead, you must go the way you've been going, ascending the stairs to what we will call Fork 1B, another carbon copy of the first fork with some very slight differences. The similarities continue as we press forward into Chamber 2B. This is the same dungeon layout as we went through the first time and the second time, with some very minor changes. That is until we get to Fork 2B. If we run straight ahead to Chamber 3B, we'll discover an enemy and a dead end. If we go back to the other fork in the path and jump through the window, we'll jump into a very familiar looking chamber, but we're not sure where we're at until we ascend the stairs and see that, yeah, okay, this is probably Chamber 4A because there's two dead ogre looking guys. Knowing now that this path is circular, if we backtrack to go to Chamber 3A, we will discover in the subchamber some differences and hopefully a path forward. When we enter this chamber, we'll see that there is no enemy like there was before, and more importantly, there's a new path forward. When we choose to go down this path, we enter the first truly new territory in this dungeon. We find ourselves going down a ladder, which is followed by a walk down a very long hallway until we see a lever. The room with the lever appears just like the first room in the dungeon, and when we pull the lever, a familiar message appears. Somewhere a heavy door is opened. If at this point you drop into the room with the lever, you'll find yourself in Chamber 1, and past that an unlocked door, and past that a Site of Grace. You're at the beginning of the dungeon. At this point you can run through that first door, which is now unlocked, pass through a wall of mist, and fight the dungeon boss. To be clear, this is one of my favorite dungeons in all of Elden Ring, including the legacy dungeons. If this run-through hasn't shown you why I think this game deserves to win Best Game Direction at the Game Awards, then allow me to sum up my argument. In Elden Ring, From Software took a risk by altering their signature game design that had won them so much acclaim. To make this game, the developers blended the mostly linear, tightly directed dungeons that they had previously mastered with a sprawling, dynamic, open world that presented new design challenges. One of the biggest of these design challenges was the necessity of asset reuse. Simply put, in order to make Elden Ring as big as they wanted it to be, with the time and resources that they had available to them, From Software was forced to implement a not insignificant amount of asset reuse, including models, level design, and more. Yet, despite this necessary design limitation, From Software did not tacitly accept that Elden Ring would be filled with monotonous player experiences. Instead, they attempted to reuse repetitious assets in order to create new player experiences. The case in point here is the Catacombs dungeons, specifically the Lindell Catacombs. To fill out the massive world of Elden Ring, From Software created different kinds of dungeons, each with their own template. One of these kinds of dungeons is the Catacombs. From Software attempted to keep all the catacombs fresh and interesting by altering the number and order of elements of which these dungeons are composed. We saw an example of this in the Stormfoot and the Murkwater Catacombs. But the Lindell Catacombs did something more interesting, more ambitious, and ultimately more compelling. The Lindell Catacombs takes the design for a single Catacombs dungeon and stacks it on top of itself almost 3 times. This is done in such a way that the player is impelled to confusion and disorientation. The player shouldn't feel this, as the dungeon does follow the formula for a standard Catacombs dungeon. However, the particular way that the dungeon reuses its own assets, the particular way that the layout is thrice stacked upon itself, forces the player to either become lost in the seeming labyrinth or to attend to the dungeon's diminutive differences and discover the new amidst the old. Indeed, it got this player to do both. Don't get me wrong, I think that the legacy dungeons in Elden Ring are incredible and stand toe-to-toe with the best that other FromSoft games have to offer. However, I think that, considered in context, the Lindell Catacombs single-handedly make Elden Ring deserving of the award for the best game design of 2022. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm a brand spanking new YouTuber and could really benefit from anything you want to throw my way. Thanks!